Welcome, everyone, to the third webinar in a quarterly series where the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the Kentucky chapter of the American Planning Association will be discussing a wide array of topics related to how we can apply a more equitable and inclusive lens to the planning profession. These webinars will be held live via Zoom and are also recorded for later viewing at apaky.org. This webinar is eligible for one AICP credit and will count as one equity credit. My name is Tom West. I'm an AICP and the Economic Development Director for the City of Covington, as well as a member of the Kentucky APA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and I will be your moderator for today's session. During this webinar, we will be discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion in comprehensive planning. The discussion will center around how to incorporate these principles in the comp plan and its implementation. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a term used to describe policies and programs that promote the representation and participation of different groups of individuals. DEI encompasses people of different ages, races, ethnicities, abilities, disabilities, genders, religions, cultures, and sexual orientations. These webinars are intended to be conversations about listening to others, even if their opinion and viewpoints might differ from your own. Respecting others' views. We all have the right to an opinion. Being okay to not feel like you fully understand a topic or the wording or terminology around it. But finally, keeping an open mind. Everyone here is on a journey of understanding, and we are all coming into this at different points of entry. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us today. Now let's meet today's experts. We have three great panelists with us today, including Emily Liu, Planning Director for Louisville Metro, Caleb Racicot, a principal with TSW in Atlanta, and pinch hitting for Kareem Simpson is Sharmili Reddy. She's the Executive Director of Planning and Development Services of Kenton County, which serves as staff to the Kenton County Planning Commission. Panelists, thank you for joining us today. To get started, can you please give the audience a brief overview of your background? And then can you tell us in one sentence what you hope to bring to this panel discussion today? Let's get started with Emily.
Thank you, Tom. I'm very grateful to be here today. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Liu. I'm the Planning Director for Louisville Metro Government. I have been here for 13 years. Prior to this job, I worked in Oldham County, Kentucky, which is a suburb just outside Louisville. I started my first planning job in Columbus, Ohio in 1995. And then my family moved to Illinois, and I worked for Lake County government for a few years. So I have been in the public service for 28 years, and I am still passionate about what I do every day. Currently, I have two goals. The first one is to help the profession that I love, which is planning. The second one is to make a difference in the community I serve. I know they are very ambitious, but they motivate me every day. So that's why I'm still passionate about planning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emily. Caleb, you want to go next?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Caleb Racicot. As Tom mentioned, I am here in Atlanta. I'm a planner with the Atlanta-based planning firm of TSW, where I specialize in zoning codes and public policy across the Southeast. We do have a small office in Lexington. And I've had the privilege of, as a consultant, of working in communities with many different sizes. I like to tell people I've worked in communities as small as 800 up to 500,000. My biggest claim to fame right now is I'm a project manager for the City of Atlanta Comprehensive Plan and concurrent zoning ordinance rewrite. So a lot of the conversations that I think we're going to have today are very applicable to really a jurisdiction of any size. And with that said, my goal for today is to give everyone some tips that I've learned as a consultant for almost 25 years now across the Southeast in how we can talk about ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion in communities that may not, at least at face value, be receptive to them, and hopefully give you some tips that you can put to application on a day-to-day basis.
Great, thank you, Caleb. Sharmili.
Thank you, Tom. Happy to be pinch hitting for Kareem this morning. So as an introduction to myself, I am someone that immigrated to the US a couple decades ago. I'm not going to age myself here, but I have been in the planning profession for a little while after graduating from the University of Cincinnati. Went away to Pennsylvania to work in the planning profession for a township for a little while, and then came back to the Northern Kentucky area, which is where I'm at in the planning field. I did veer away a little bit from planning and got into city administration for a couple of years. I was the city administrator for Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, up in Northern Kentucky here for a couple of years, and then decided to come back into the planning field to head our institution, which is Planning and Development Services of Kent County. We are a multi-jurisdictional planning agency, so we cover 20 different jurisdictions, and we'll talk more about that during the course of this webinar. What I'm hoping to share today is that we are in the process of updating our comprehensive plan, and I want to share a little bit about our journey, and then especially in the equity space, and then offer hopefully a few words of encouragement for those that are in, like Caleb said, in somewhat conservative areas maybe in considering equity, just a word of encouragement and some thoughts on how maybe you could go about doing that. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sharmili, and thanks, Caleb and Emily. So let's dive right in here. I've got a two-part question and a different question for each one of you. So Emily, I'll start with you. A couple of years ago, when I was at the National Planning Conference in San Diego, I had the pleasure of hearing you speak on this very topic. And you all had made some progress at that time in Louisville on the comp plan. And I know you've done a lot more things since then. But could you maybe go back in time a little bit here and talk about how you all introduced the topics of inclusion and equity into your process? And then also, how has Louisville's history, I guess, with planning informed the whole DEI approach that you've taken to this latest comp plan update?
Thank you, Tom. Before I start to answer your question, let me offer my one sentence. I forgot about that earlier. So my little tip about the subject is, hopefully I can bring this today, is diversity, inclusion, and equity have to be intentional. So that's my offer. Now, talking about Louisville's comprehensive plan is a tremendous effort. So Louisville's latest comprehensive plan, called Plan 2040, it represented over 6,000 voices, including metro staff, an advisory committee, which include a diverse group of people, and also resident volunteers. The committee itself is made up of different neighborhood people from different neighborhood, community organizations, as well as development and business interests. It was not only adopted by Louisville Metro government. For those who don't know the structure of Louisville, we are a consolidated government. So we have one Louisville Metro government, but also from zoning perspective, we have 12 small cities that have zoning authority. So the comprehensive plan not only have to be adopted by Louisville Metro government, also has to be adopted by all these small cities that have zoning authority. So that was done in 2018, and the comprehensive plan became effective January 1st, 2019. It's been almost 5 years, believe it or not. The comprehensive plan includes 5 overarching principles, and one of them is equity. So this was like 5-6 years ago. The process itself took more than 2 years. We started about the process, like looking at the data, definitely look at history. That's all part of it. So the equity component of the comprehensive plan is described as Louisville Metro is a community that values diversity and recognize that resources, opportunities, and outcomes must be shared by all. And also Louisville Metro seeks to engage all citizens in the decision-making process and address the history. Tom briefly talked about history. So the comprehensive plan and Louisville Metro government must address the history of inequities and their ongoing impact. Not just the history, what happened, let's forget about it, but it has impact to this very day, particularly among communities of color. Louisville Metro built environment supports the creation of safe neighborhoods while providing equitable access to quality education, employment, and affordable housing. So for all citizens, so not just a small group of certain people, but it has to be provided to all citizens. The community enjoys the benefit of economic growth and the improvements to build a natural environment in and around neighborhoods. So really talking about having, providing all of this to all people. So that's kind of one guiding principles. And later on, we also did some research on the history of Louisville planning and zoning. For those of you who may already heard about this, our office documented in a story map called Confronting Racism in City Planning and Zoning. It's a very well done story map by our staff, outstanding work. It's being referenced at the national level, state level, and it used as a model for other cities. So in that story map, the research we did, we find out back more than 100 years, all these inequity actually created by, was intentional. So back in 1914, Louisville passed a housing segregation ordinance. The ordinance is called segregation ordinance. So that was no question, was intentional. It basically says this block, if it's mostly white, the people of color are not allowed to move into this block, vice versa. So the goal is to prohibit people of color, or to the goal is to segregate, and it prohibit people of color from purchasing or even living on a block most occupied by white. So that's the first attempt in the city, but eventually that was overturned by Supreme Court. It was deemed unconstitutional, but that does not stop the intentional segregation. And then after that, what become more prevalent is deed restriction. People probably familiar with that. A lot deed restriction even today still contain language saying people of color are not allowed to live in certain community. And then everybody knows after that is redlining, urban renewal, even the zoning itself. The zoning itself is exclusionary, to say the least, including Louisville. Currently, 75% of Louisville land is zoned for single family and single family only. Up until 3 years ago, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, accessory dwelling unit, which is also called granny flat, are not allowed to be built by right in the single family zoning. We have changed that since 2021. But so the intention was to exclude certain population. So that's kind of the history, and that's definitely play a big part in our work to include equity, not only in a comprehensive plan, but also makes a lot of effort in Louisville to reform the zoning to be more equitable, to provide services to for all people. I hope I answered that question, the first question.
Yeah, thank you. And as usual, Louisville is providing a lot of leadership in the Commonwealth on this. And and also for reminding us that if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it, or something like that, I think. So thanks for that, Emily. My next question is for Sharmili, and I really appreciate you stepping in for Kareem today. And I know you had a lot of conversations with Kareem, so I'm going to ask you if you would to kind of channel him a little bit. But you also have a lot of knowledge because your team works very closely with the comp plan committee. And I know the comp plan here in Kenton County is currently being updated. And in the past, it really hasn't addressed equity and inclusion, at least not in Emily's words, intentionally. It hasn't. So can you talk about two things? First, how do you see diversity and inclusion being included in both the process and recommendations? And then secondly, and again, based on things that Kareem has talked to you about, what does a blueprint look like for implementation of some of these? And if you want to focus specifically on the DEI part of the plan and its implementation, what does that blueprint look like in the end?
Thanks for that question, Tom. And before I answer that, I want to say thanks to Emily for her leadership through all of this work in Louisville. I think the rest of us around the state hear about it, know about it, and all definitely strive to achieve that one day. So I really appreciate that, Emily. I'll just put it out there, we are nowhere close to what Louisville has done. In order to understand where we're at, I want to take a minute to just share our background and what we do here at PDS. So we are a multi-jurisdictional agency, and somewhat like Louisville, we have 20 different jurisdictions that we serve. We have a 50-year history of comprehensive planning process in the county, which I'm very proud of because we have, even through tough times, we have all of our communities that have come together and said, we want one comprehensive plan for the county versus 20 different ones for each jurisdiction. So we're very proud of that. But with that comes a lot of challenges because we cover everything from an urban area, which is Covington, the city that Tom's from, very progressive, very accepting, just known in the region for that. And we go all the way out to a rural community within our county. So we're everything from urban to rural, 20 different jurisdictions, 20 different ideas, ideologies, philosophies, elected officials. So our comprehensive planning process is it's not simple. And so I want to go back to the basics of why I feel like we do comprehensive planning. It is not always about the end product, right? It is about the journey. It's about the journey and how much we push these ideologies, what the community is willing to accept, and what we as planners are willing to put out there for the community to accept and consider and come out at the very end as a process. So what I will say is that equity has not been an easy conversation for us. I suspect it's an easy conversation anywhere, but it definitely hasn't been an easy one for us from the very get-go. But we are still in the very early stages of our update process, and I'm very proud of what our team has done. We have done a really good job on the public engagement portion of it. We have gone out to places that we would have never gone out before. We were at the Pride Festival. We were at Fiesta, where the Hispanic population was. We were at any venue that we could think of where, traditionally the folks that don't come to public meetings would be there. And we went and found them and sought their input and incorporated that we'll be incorporating that into our process as we move forward. So I would suggest that, again, if you're in a community like us that is just kind of, considering this equity space and has a lot of politics and other things to consider around it, you don't have to go all in all at once, right? Sometimes these processes are incremental. Sometimes a lot of times these things take some time and effort to work through the community. And so even if through your process, you're able to take one step ahead, it is absolutely worth the effort. The other thing I will say is Kareem, who I'm pinch hitting for today again. It is really important who the chair of your comprehensive planning committee ends up being. I think that's a very, very important consideration, because they kind of set the tone for how far you're willing to push things out in the community. And Kareem has been a fantastic chair for us, trying to advocate for all voices in our comprehensive plan. And also for him, I will say that some of the things that he has been saying is we're not at this on our own. We've got neighbors on all our sides that are probably also working through this process. So maybe there are opportunities where we can join forces and strategically work on some initiatives versus going at it on our own. So for implementation, I would envision things like working together with our neighbors across the river on either side, to move some of these issues forward. So I hope that was helpful. Again, I just want to offer a word of encouragement that the equity conversation obviously is not an easy one to have from the very beginning of the process, but again, look for those specific opportunities where you can make a little bit of you can take a step in the right direction, I guess, when it comes to equity.
Yeah, and I will fess up to being one of the stakeholders here in Kenton County that has pushed Sharmili and the committee really hard to go as far as possible on the DEI pieces of the comp plan, but they do have to balance some of those other 19 communities and jurisdictions that are here in the county. So thank you, Sharmili, and thank you for providing such valuable arguments back when I start to push a little hard on some of those. So Caleb, I want to move on to you because I know that your firm has worked on some of these issues in several rural communities. And I think probably a lot of folks out there have an impression, whether it's right or not, maybe you can talk about that most rural communities don't really have a lot of diversity in them. So why should this matter to planners? I mean, other than the fact that APA tells us it should matter to us, right, for our credentials. But why should it matter to planners in these areas? And then the second part of that, if you could kind of talk about some of the lessons learned, maybe that your firm has seen, and how do you approach this topic in very small, maybe conservative rural areas?
Thank you, Tom. I think first we need to really challenge the assumption that rural communities are homogenous. In our experience, there is always a population that is and has been in many of these jurisdictions for, in many cases, centuries, that isn't necessarily representative in the dominant political structure or even cultural structure. So the first thing that we always do as part of comprehensive planning, and this is not going to be any surprise to anyone, is I think it's first critical to look at your demographics early on in the process, and you can do that sort of formally with a demographic analysis, but you also need to do it informally by talking to houses of worship, talking to people at schools, talking to elected officials, and really try to understand, even in a relatively homogeneous area, what the diversity is. So that means thinking about the distribution of income, the distribution of age, which is a huge one in rural areas, and then of course, racial and ethnic distribution. And invariably, I will tell you that rural areas tend, in our experience, to have a lot more diversity than you may even find in many metro suburban areas. They're largely invisible, but in many cases there are higher percentages of folks that would value or be impacted by DEI discussions than in some of these metro areas. Particularly, we find that incidence of persons with disabilities is actually typically higher in rural areas than in metro. But once you figure that out, I think, as you've alluded to, we are ethically obligated by AICP to really advocate for these communities, especially if they are not part of the season ticket holders, if you will, of public engagement. The folks who are going to go to every meeting, who have the privilege to go to every meeting. And so a lot of times, as Sharmili mentioned, that means targeting these communities as you set up your engagement process. We've invariably realized that, we may meet people standing out in front of Walmart that would never come to a public meeting, and set up our process to talk to folks for 2 to 3, 4 minutes on a weekend. That's been extremely helpful. We have attended events after church on Wednesday evening or Sunday morning to get an understanding there. And then recently in a rural jurisdiction here in Georgia, I actually attended a weekend chicken festival, which was just amazing fun. Had people who were, I promise you, never went to a public meeting come and talk about the comp plan. And so I think, again, setting up your process so that you think outside the box, you really have a lot of more informal techniques. But with that said, I really want to tag team on what Sharmili mentioned about appreciating, accepting the role of incrementalism in communities. I think we as planners all sort of have an ideal end game in our mind, but we are obligated to work with jurisdictions to understand what will get politically passed there, and to, in many cases, promote incrementalism. So I wanted to talk a little bit now about some of the lessons that I've learned doing this for 25 years. The first thing is, if you have resources to hire a consultant, or even if you don't, acknowledge that comprehensive planning is not about creating the document. It is about a process of building trust. And we, as a TSW, that is so fundamental to how we work, is truly listening to folks, as I mentioned, both on their terms and creating more standard procedures. In some communities where we don't have a heavy deadline, we actually tailor the processes to run at the speed of trust, we call it, which is a term I've stolen from someone. I don't remember who said it at a meeting once, but it was really powerful, and I like to use it. The other thing as part of that, though, is setting up your process so that you are very aware, I hate to say it, but of the politics of the situation, right? You can do the best comprehensive plan. You can have an amazing outreach process, but if your elected officials are not engaged, they're not on board, they're not consulted during the process, you can get to the floor and they will invariably see, this is the first I've seen of it, and just, your whole process can go to pot. So the political piece, as much as it can be a challenge, is extremely important. And again, building trust with the elected officials. Now, in terms of specifics, right, in terms of the kinds of things that are often in conversations of equity, inclusion, diversity, we find that we're able to get the most traction talking about housing. And housing is so fundamental in pretty much every community. And that means, thinking about whether a jurisdiction has housing for the folks who are there, who may be struggling. So invariably there's conversations about attainable housing and affordable housing about that. And honestly, that only gets you so far in some jurisdictions. But we find if you're able to get the economic development folks on board and get them to become your allies for housing that is affordable to workers and is necessary to attract businesses, you're going to get further than you would about just talking about housing from an equity lens. I hate to say it, but job creation, tax revenue growth, getting the chamber on board can be extremely powerful in jurisdictions. The other thing that I mentioned early on with regard to housing is, if you can, try to engage the young people who are in your community, because comp plans invariably, at least in Georgia, have a 15, 20-year time frame. And so it's really important to get the youth of the community involved, let them share what their aspirations are, what their needs are, and integrate that into the perspective as well. And then that also can be really helpful when you think about, folks who may want to retire and downsize and have a different housing opportunity that isn't present in the community. So it's sort of like taking all of these small pieces and finding common thread, which is also, to Emily's point, the fact that we might need more than just single family zoning in communities, and sort of creating a process that builds coalitions. One of the other things that's incredibly useful when you're talking about housing or mixed use development or other, again, more progressive ideas, is that we find that a lot of the communities we work actually have really beloved, and I use that word intentionally, beloved places that may have the attributes that can be models for future growth. Every older town will have older neighborhoods that have, legal non-conforming apartments or corner stores or that sort of thing. And we find that when you have these conversations about sort of new types of land use and new types of housing diversity, you don't want to talk about the bigger cities in your state. You never want to talk about Atlanta in Georgia, but you always want to talk about that 1 or 2 blocks that may be in the town that people know and love and are willing to support or advocate for more of that. So definitely use local examples. Never talk about what they did in Louisville or what they did in Lexington or what they did in Cincinnati. It's always about the local precedents that people support. And then I think part of coalition building, as I sort of alluded to before, is thinking about the folks that may have an interest in DEI, but again, don't call it that. That's going to be your religious leaders. I know every single community we've worked with has a church or another house of worship that is very focused on extremely progressive ideas, but as part of their mission. So engage the religious leaders into the process, see if there are ways that they can be your allies and that they can be really advocates for when the plan is done. I think there are also some communities that we work that have nonprofits that, again, may not be at the fore, but there may be Habitat, there may be other groups that are focused on these issues that you can build upon. So that's sort of the structure. And then the final thing that I have learned is that you really need to have all of these conversations in a way that is, I don't know how else I say this other than saying not condescending, right? So much of building trust is about being honest with people, listening to them, and speaking with them in a way that is respectful. I have seen, unfortunately, a lot of planners come in and they'll use the jargon, the stuff that just doesn't go over well because it may have baggage associated with it. And so one of the things that I try to do, and I think I'm relatively good at, is talking about ideas without using the trigger words that people can Google and then equate with, the 15-minute city or Agenda 21 or, any of this other sort of conspiratory stuff that's out there. It's talking to people in terms that the average person who's not a planner can understand. So just, keep that in mind, be honest with people, tell them when you don't know an answer. Never tell them that they're wrong, but find the little nugget of incremental advancement, and I think you'll get a long way. I've had great success from some very, very, very conservative communities in getting things done like allowing citywide accessory dwelling units. Never called them that. Allowing multifamily housing, getting rid of minimum house sizes. We had one case of where we had some Jim Crow era legislation that was actually in the zoning code, and we were able to get support for taking it out. And then we've even had language that has had a very sort of 1950s definition of what a family was, that was the basis for all their housing regulations, was extremely homophobic, was extremely classist, was extremely just contrary to the way that even in rural communities people live today. And we were able to successfully remove that through this process. Long answer, but I knew I had a lot to cover. Thanks.
Great, Caleb. And I want to, I feel a little validated because I came from a meeting of Northern Kentucky economic developers yesterday where we discussed a housing study that was recently done for the larger Northern Kentucky area, I believe about 6 or 7 counties. And one of the strategies we talked about was discussing diversity in housing from a job development and workforce housing perspective. So what you said there kind of validated that. What I want to do now is I want to throw a question out there for all 3 of you. And I'm going to kind of build this around 2 of the larger metropolitan areas in Kentucky. But you'll see where I'm going with this. So Caleb, I would like for you to chime in on this too. But Emily and Sharmili, both of you work in very urbanized parts of the Commonwealth. But the makeup of those 2 urban areas is somewhat different. Louisville and Jefferson County is relatively progressive. It's got a very significant minority population and was at the center of national attention in 2020 with the Breonna Taylor protests. Kenton County, on the other hand, while it is a very urbanized county and part of the greater Cincinnati metro, is made up of a lot of small, demographically anyway, relatively homogeneous and conservative bedroom communities, almost or really small, if any, minority populations in some of them. The exception of that is Covington, of course. And we here promote diversity. And many times we're at 180 degrees from a lot of our neighbors, especially on social issues. But one thing we've noticed is that in recent years, many of those smaller, nor ordinarily seen homogeneous communities have adopted fairness ordinances. And fairness ordinances, Caleb, in Kentucky, extend equal protection for LGBTQ citizens in our communities for employment, public accommodations, and housing. But we've seen a lot of these smaller communities adopt those. So I'm really curious if Sharmili and Emily, to kind of kick this off, if you all could talk about the opportunities and challenges that you all are facing at bringing equity and inclusion into the comp plans, and specifically how maybe the demographics and political leadership in these varied communities that are within each of your jurisdictions contribute to the challenges as well as to the opportunities. And in fairness here, we'll start with Sharmili this time and then go to Emily and then Caleb.
All right. Well, so I'll start with maybe some of our challenges in venturing into the equity space. Obviously, I think one of our biggest challenges is that the minute we talk about or use the term equity, everybody's minds go to the extreme examples of what it means. And so I think one of our challenges, but an opportunity that we have as planners, is to help our elected officials and our residents understand what it is that we mean when it comes to equity in planning. We are talking about housing. We are talking about land use. We're talking about all the issues that we normally address in a comprehensive planning process, just with a different lens. So I think that that is probably one of our biggest challenges, is that the perceptions of what we mean by equity is so far out and so far out of reach for so many people, and so far removed from what does that have to do with planning, that we have to do, we have some work to do in that space and bring that back to something that's relatable, like I think what Caleb was saying earlier. So that's our challenge. I mean, obviously politics is everywhere. So that's just something that all of us deal with. It's not unique to Kent County, but we do have some elected leaders in Kent County that represent certain jurisdictions that would support certain issues of equity. So again, how do we find those key champions who are well respected in the community, whose voices will be heard a lot more than ours as planners, and how do we use that energy to kind of make a little bit more progress in this space. So again, our opportunities are tremendous. I think I refuse to get I refuse to back down or give up, or just like we did in 2014. Our biggest challenge at the time was property rights and Agenda 21, and we were facing these perceptions that the community had about what we're trying to do, and we found middle ground, and we moved. I feel like we moved our communities forward in that space. So I'm very optimistic that we will be able to do it. We just have to do it along with our community and not try to step ahead of them.
Emily?
I would like to follow up quickly on Caleb's comment about Louisville may not be a good example in Kentucky, but across the country, Louisville is a perfect example. People say, I don't want to use New York. I don't want to use LA. I want to use Louisville example. So just perspective, depends on what geography area you're talking about. So in Louisville, of course, in Kentucky, it's kind of a leader in promoting equity, and we're very proud of our administration and Metro Council. Many years ago, the previous administration actually, under Mayor Fisher, he established the Office of Equity. And the current administration even expanded on that. So there is this support of equity in the administration, and also in Metro Council itself as well. They have equity, inclusion, and diversity committee of a committee of the Metro Council, and they pass ordinance. I'll give you an example. I talked about intentionality. It's very important because before the Metro Council passed ordinance about we need to promote diversity in the board commission committee. For those planners who work with committee directly, we all know they are the decision makers, and they make a decision that impact not only a small area, probably citywide or even county-wide. And that impact probably will have many years to come, 50 years, 100 years down the road, that still see the impact. So at one time, when I first started here, a planning commission, for example, 10 commissioner members, 9 male, 1 female. And I'm sure there's more than one female that's qualified to sit on the planning commission and willing to serve on the planning commission, because sometimes you just don't pay attention. I'm not saying what's wrong. When you don't pay attention, that's what you ended up with. And then the mayor's office and Metro Council really started paying attention, trying to bring diversity to the board, to the decision makers, right? Trying to have 5 men, 5 women. We have about 25% African American. Make sure your representation reflect the population you serve. Not like everybody has to be people of color to serve on that, but need to represent the community. So I think being intentional, that does help, bring different people, not just people of color or race or culture. It also age, you mentioned before, younger people. We historically have less young people surround. We still do. We still need to do more work on that. They're probably just more busier. but we still need to reach out to them. There's other consideration, gender. So I think it's very important to be intentional on this. Metro Council has been really good. They also passed a couple of years ago, promote, by the way, not only we have office equity, we also have office women. So promote gender equality, and also Office of Immigrant Affairs. So we have a growing immigrant community. So that's very important. And then a couple of years ago, Metro Council passed a resolution or ordinance giving city staff maternity and paternity leave. That was never happened before. Like if you have a baby, if you don't have a sick leave, sorry, you probably have to go back to work in 3 weeks, but this will give everybody 12 weeks paid leave, regardless whether you have sick leave or not. So I think Louisville has done a lot more. Now I have to say, Tom, Louisville it's probably very progressive in Kentucky, but as I mentioned earlier, Louisville is still a consolidated government. There's Metro Council, there are also a lot of suburban cities, and the conversation there is definitely slightly different than here. Thinking about go to the communities in the suburb, talking to their administration, and a lot of things come up. We don't want multifamily. If it's multifamily, I will prefer condo. I don't want renters. Those questions come up a lot. Feeling that renters are they call those people. So I feel there's still a lot of education. It's probably people have different perspective about renters and owners. But to me, to planners, it doesn't matter whether it's condos or apartment. They are just same, right? Multifamily. We treat them the same from land use perspective, but people really oppose apartment a lot harder if you propose versus condos. So there's still a lot work to do, even in Louisville. There's different in the urban area, a suburban area, at different smaller, government or versus Louisville Metro. But overall, I think I'm very proud of the work Louisville has done over the years.
Thanks, Emily. And before Caleb jumps in here, I want to remind everybody who's with us today that if you have questions you'd like to ask any or all of the panelists, use the Q&A function here in Zoom, and we'll try to get to your questions after Caleb finishes up here.
Great. Well, I'm going to be very brief. I think the secret for a lot of this is to talk about ideas without talking about ideas. Again, really find those nuggets of values, for lack of a better term, that are compatible with DEI goals, and make them applicable to the community, but avoid the national jargon is so effective. The other thing I did want to mention is that sometimes these processes will actually mobilize folks who become frustrated with the political situations. We have had a couple of governments where, for better or worse, they've done a comp plan or a zoning code across an election. And sometimes these people will come out of the woodwork and get elected in, and they will have used the inability of previous elected officials as a starting point for advancing DEI goals. And so never advocate that, try to avoid elections, but if you have it, sometimes acknowledge that these processes can be ways to mobilize people to run for office.
Great. Thank you, Caleb. Let's see, we've got a question here. Are there any national models that you would hold up as kind of a gold standard in equity in planning? And Caleb, I'll throw that out to you first there.
I am not familiar with any. I do know that locally, and I work primarily in the Southeast, the city of Decatur, Georgia, which is a extremely progressive jurisdiction about 5 miles east of Atlanta, They have a very strong strategic plan that is different from their comp plan, and it is heavily based on goals of equity and diversity. So I would look that up, but others may have a sense of what is happening outside of the Southeast. So I'll defer to Emily or Sharmili.
Louisville.
I was gonna say that, yeah.
So
Go ahead. I think we have using a lot of model is Minneapolis. I mean, I'm not saying it's like a equity focus, but more housing focus. So that's very inspire us a lot too. They adopted, they eliminated a single family zoning in a comp plan. They be implementing that, eliminate parking. So I think not just for Louisville, probably that city has set, you know, a role model for a lot of cities across the country.
and that was Minneapolis. You said I may have talked over you there, Emily.
Yes, Minneapolis. Yes.
Sharmili, when you guys were getting ready for this one, were there any models you all were looking at, either for engagement or content?
Louisville, we don't have to look too far. We've got folks right here in our state doing some amazing work. And so, you know, that's generally where we are turning to for our guidance. I will caution everybody though, again, as we've talked about here, I think national models, local models are all good to know how far you can go with these conversations, but you really have to have a good grasp on what your community is ready for and understand what they're willing to accept before embracing those things. But again, you know, we all need inspiration, and there's plenty around us, for us at least in Louisville, to look for. So that's where we look for guidance.
Okay, so we've got a little bit of time left, so I've got maybe a brief question for each one of you. Emily, what's next for your team in Louisville? I know you guys are working towards implementation of your plan, right?
Yeah, one of the biggest implementation, of course, is the zoning. So the comprehensive plan is a policy guide recommendation, but it really has to be implemented in order to see the effects. So the history we did is actually not part of comprehensive plan. It was implementation of the comprehensive plan as well. So 2020, summer 2020, all the social justice movement that really get us started. But I do want you to know that the zoning reform is not easy. It sounds like very easy for Lou. It's not. It's very, very difficult work. I wasn't really certain at first, but we did a few things I would like to share with you. First of all, you need some champions in your city council, metro council. This is law. If the law does not pass, all your work, you waste your time. So the first step I did is that I went to Metro Council, the president of Metro Council, and asked, are you going to support this? And he said, I'm going to send resolution your way in 30 days. It was amazing, the cooperation we got from them. So we actually received a resolution first from Metro Council before I even started the reform work. And the reform work is actually as progressive as it sounds, is actually incremental. We have 46 different reform items we need to do, but obviously some of those are going to take years. We start with low-hanging fruits. The granny flat is one of those low-hanging fruits. And we did not expect every Metro Council to support it, because it's something like this, you may not get unanimous. You only need the majority. You need enough support to pass this law. So that's what we did. So we passed granny flat. Since we're all planners, I'm going to say it's ADU. So ADU is by right now in Louisville. That was a couple of years ago. And we have seen the application increase tenfold because of that. It's by right. And we also legalize urban agriculture, make it easy to do urban agriculture, because some of the marginalized community, they don't even have access to fresh food, and some of them grow their own. So this make it easier. We eliminate floor area ratio, FAR, all planners, FAR, this is going to be on your AICP test. And we eliminate FAR for housing. We allow duplex in multifamily zoning district, even though the lot size is small. In Louisville, in the past, if you're zoned multifamily, but your lot is not big enough, you cannot even build a duplex. So we made it universal, regardless lot size. If you're 500 square feet, there's no 500 square feet lot, but you can build a duplex. And also we reduced the setback from 30 feet, we're suburban, right, to 15 feet, allowing more room for building the granny flat and everything else. So it's tremendous. We changed the daycare, allowing daycare in residential zoning district to help support working families. So we're still in the process of doing more rezoning reform work. And I want you to know what I'm presenting here is not the work I did. It's the team. I have a team of passionate planners in my office, which I'm very proud of. And we also not only have Champion Metro Council, you have passionate staff. You also have somebody from outside to support you in the event you are attacked and misinformation. You cannot defend yourself, folks. You need other people to defend you. So those are the three tricks. Champion the Metro Council, passionate staff, and your supporters outside your office.
Emily, if only you were a little more passionate about your work. Caleb, I'm going to give you a chance now as a consultant to do a little shameless promotion here of your firm. Is there a community or a couple of communities that you've done some work in that you would maybe hold up as a good example if folks from rural communities would want to go and look at how some of these topics have been incorporated into some of those plans?
We just had a zoning code adopted in Statesboro, Georgia, which is way South Georgia. But it was surprisingly progressive, some of the ideas there. They are, you talk about economic development, they're about an hour from the big Hyundai plant. And so they really were interested in promoting housing. So that was on their comp plan. That was on their, should be on their website, City of Statesboro, Georgia. There's also a really wonderful downtown master plan. And I wanted to say to your question to Emily, a lot of times there may be support for more progressive ideas in certain areas of the community. And so what we did in Statesboro is we really focused on the downtown and the older neighborhoods. They had a terribly racist policy that burdened the historic African-American neighborhoods, where if your lot was not conforming, which none of the Black neighborhoods were, you could not build on it without a variance. And so we told the council that there was a sort of come to Jesus conversation during the code writing process, and we took out all that Jim Crow era stuff that was harming the Black neighborhoods in Statesboro. So definitely take a look at that. We've done some work in Metro Atlanta in a city called Woodstock, which is a great example of sort of suburban retrofit and downtown revitalization. But visit our website, tsw-design.com. I did want to say too, Tom, if I may have the privilege of this, when you're doing any of these kind of processes, you really need to make sure that when you get to the part of writing the plan, that you build in conversations of trade-offs and acknowledging conflicts. I mentioned Hall County, Georgia recently, where the strongest public sentiments were, we want affordable housing, we want to preserve our rural way of life, but we want large lot single family homes. And so we had a whole diatribe discussion during the planning process and the comprehensive plan about how some of those aspirations are not, they're not achievable given land economics. And so there's a whole section in that comprehensive plan that we're writing now called trade-offs, where you describe the existing conditions, you talk about the public ideas, we then describe the trade-off process, and then finally you get to the official comp plan policies and recommendations.
Great, and thanks for pointing those out. Sharmili, we got about 2 minutes left. I want to give you the floor if there's a point you want to make or anything that you want to pass on to our participants today.
Well, I just want to say, this is important work that we all do, and our hearts are in the right place, and we know we can do this. Sometimes, again, just a reminder, it has to be incremental for our communities. But I appreciate Caleb's thoughts, and I appreciate Emily's thoughts today, too. I learned a lot from this conversation, so thank you.
I did as well, and I promise not to push as hard through the rest of the process. So to wrap up today, I want to thank our panelists, and thanks to all of you who joined us today. Every time we present one of these topics, we're encouraged that we are bringing more and more planners to the table and making discussions about diversity and inclusion easier for both us as planners and with our peers, as well as us as facilitators in our communities. Our next DEI webinar will be in February, and the topic will be related to Black History Month. So watch your inboxes for that invitation. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, and we certainly hope you learned a lot. Thank you.